Good morning everyone, what's going on? It is Adam from Green Auto Services and welcome back to another video. Today we have a 2013 Ford Fiesta that's in for a couple of issues. The first issue is that there is play in a suspension ball joint which is causing a bit of a knock, but more importantly it's actually due for its first cam belt change. Now these are incredibly important. Inside the engines there are mechanical components that occupy the same space just at different times, and the cam belt is designed to keep those components away from each other as they go into the same spaces. So I hope that makes sense. So it's very important because if it snaps you are looking at catastrophic engine damage and you're going to be looking at a new engine pretty much. So if you learn a little something or enjoying the video, please don't hesitate to hit the like and subscribe button. On that note, let's get straight into it. Okay, here we go then guys. So we are now going to get started on replacing the cam belt and the water pump. So the cam belt actually drives the water pump or the coolant pump. So whilst we are down there with everything stripped off, we are going to replace that as well. And I'll talk a little bit more in depth about that when we actually get to it. For now, I'm going to spin you around, just have a quick look at the engine, and I will try and take you through a step-by-step guide of how to get down there, replace it, put it all back together. So let's get you spun around. So this is the 1.5litre TDCI engine. Now the cam belt is down the left hand side here. There is a big plastic cover underneath all of this that we need to remove. So to start with, I'm going to be taking off the engine cover, getting the coolant reservoir out of the way but not disconnected, removing various clips and cables so I can actually successfully take as many bolts out that are holding the timing cover on. So let's get straight into it. And actually, just to give you a little bit of space, I'm actually going to go ahead and remove the headlamp, which is just a couple of T30s, one down there, one up the top there, and a small plastic rivet that just comes out. So with a bit of a tough pull, it will actually pop out of a bracket down there, disconnect the wiring harness, and the headlamp just lifts right out. And there we go, we actually have now a ton of room to work around. Okay, so there's the first half of the upper timing cover. It's only being held in with 4 7mm bolts, 2 up top, 1 in the centre here, and then 1 down on the end, which actually came out. Do be careful, these are designed to not come out when they're completely undone. This one did start unscrewing out of it. It's perfectly fine because it only screws into plastic, but just be careful, and if they do come out, just remember where they went. So that's the top cover. So very quickly, you've probably noticed as well that I've actually got the coolant reservoir over here. There is actually a big pipe underneath that inevitably I had to disconnect. So you will lose a lot of coolant. It may be out of your interest to drain the system before you do any of this. I've actually just clamped it up down the back of the engine and pushed it out the way for the time being. And disconnecting that large pipe allows you just to bring it up over and then just rest it gently on top of the engine for the time being. Just watch out for these 2 coolant pipes here. They are flexible plastic, but they are still plastic nonetheless, so just make sure you don't put too much tension on that, because if they break then you're going to main dealer only to go and get these, which will probably be quite expensive. Okay, so far we've managed to get the top cover off, and this is exposing the timing belt, which currently is driving the camshaft sprocket, which in turn drives the camshaft. What we're going to do now is, for the time being, we are done up here in the engine bay without taking the engine mounting off, which we will need to do, purely because I don't want to be lying on my back getting underneath the car with the engine supported. So I'm going to get the vehicle up in the air to do as many of the under vehicle components off to save me laying on the floor. Okay, so before we take the vehicle up in the air, it's also a good idea we actually detension the tensioner to remove the auxiliary belt, which we do need to do. So you're going to need some sort of locking pin, and this is the top of the tensioner right here. Now the only way I've found to do this, unless you remove the engine bracket first, get yourself an adjustable spanner, and you basically want to get it on the top of the ear there, just like that, and then you just want to pull it back gently until you're ready to put the new pin in. It is tricky, it is difficult, it's not the best tensioner design ever, but if you just pull it back as much as you can, then hopefully got enough room. Okay, there we go. Perfect, there we go, that's a much better shot. So as you can see, that's where my adjustable spanner is. I've pulled it backwards towards the front of the vehicle, and I managed to get this locking pin in past that knuckle, if you will, and then into a locating slot just behind it. So actually now, if I take that off, the tensioner is now holding itself off, so we can remove the auxiliary belt. Okay, and because on this model we do actually have a wiring harness which runs across the front of the cam belt cover, or the lower cam belt cover, it's actually being held in place by the 2 of the 3 bolts that hold the tensioner in. So I've just taken 1 out, 2 out, and the wiring harness is a lot looser, which is great. Okay, so the car is in the air. Now we've already removed the under tray from when we did the lower suspension arm. As you can see, I've spilt a little bit of coolant disconnecting that coolant hose from up there. Whilst we're up, the next thing to do is to remove this plastic cover which covers the auxiliary belt side of the engine. And now that's removed, let's take the auxiliary belt off, as it's already detensioned from what we did earlier. There we go. Okay, so here we are underneath the vehicle to the side of the engine. Now I've already gone and removed the cover, and this exposes the crank pulley, the AC compressor and the alternator, and there's the tensioner up there as well. So as you can see, it's a little bit wet. You do need to carry on, take the crank position sensor off, so disconnect that. The wiring loom does hinder us a little bit, so there is a small bracket up there which I think is being held in place. It's quite difficult to see with, it looks like a couple of 10 mils, maybe a 13 mil on the bracket. So I'm going to go ahead and take that off just to make sure that we can get enough room around the wiring harness to take that lower cover off. So let's do that now. Okay, so I've disconnected the crank sensor wire. I have taken off an 8mm bolt that holds the bracket, so we've got a lot more movement to allow us access. The next thing I'm going to do is remove this rubber cover from the crank pulley. I've just got myself a pair of pliers, grab the centre bit and just pull it outwards. There we go. And that exposes the bolt that holds it all together. Okay, so a very slight change of plan, because that wiring harness is there. This wiring harness isn't on all vehicles. You do get a lot of these Peugeot engines where the wiring harness is routed over the top and it's already out the way. So just to save time, I've already removed the tensioner by removing the last bolt. That came out really easily. I've already supported the engine using a jack. I'm now going to remove the engine mount top part and the engine part. That's going to give us so much access, be able to remove the lower cover, and we'll be able to get it timed up as well. Okay, so the next thing I want to do, I've removed that engine mount off to give us more access. I can't quite take this off yet. It is loose, but it's on a dowel, so you need to take the lower cover off, and before we can do that, we need to take the crank pulley off. But before we take the crank pulley off, we need to get this timed up. So there is a hole right there at the end of my finger, which acts as a hole for your locking pin, and that hole right there, which is in the cylinder head, that is where we need it lined up to, so we can put an 8mm bit in there to lock it off. So I'll turn the engine over now and we'll get that lined up. Okay, so once it's lined up, and this has to be lined up perfectly, I don't have the official locking kit, but anything of an 8mm diameter will do. I use an 8mm screw bit, or a drill bit even, and then that just slots right in there. Yeah, that is perfect, and that is locked off. I'm just going to leave that in there for 2 seconds, because this is the perfect opportunity to put a mark at the top against the back of the engine to know exactly where my timing marks are. So just using a bit of Tip-X, I'm going to mark one of the teeth at the top against the back of the engine, so I know exactly the position of the sprocket when it comes to timing it back up again after replacing the belt. And there we are. That's my mark, just there, against the back of the engine, just there. So I know, even if anything accidentally moves, I know exactly where the sprocket needs to be perfectly timed. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to remove the drill bit, because now I'm going to take off the lower crank using my gun. This will be the most difficult part if you don't have like quite a powerful gun, because in theory you should lock off the crank at the flywheel by taking the starter motor out, but in the position that I'm in, I'm going to use my gun to get that bolt straight out. Okay, so here is the crank pulley. Now, this just came straight off. Once you've got the bolt out, this will just fall off. Make a note though, in the back of this, there is actually a recess or a tab which locates in the actual pickup ring that sits on the end of the crankshaft. Now, that's all you need to remove for the time being. The pickup ring here we're actually going to leave in situ, because there is actually a timing hole that we can lock up as well. Before we lock that up though, we need to remove this lower timing cover. So removing the pulley has given us access to these 7mm bolts. So let's go ahead, take all of them out and work that lower cover off, working around that wiring loom, which will probably make our lives a little bit more difficult, but it is what it is. Okay. I forgot how annoying these wiring harnesses are to just get the timing cover off. So I've managed to get the cover off. What I've done is there is actually a small plastic dowel or bracket just behind here, my finger's right on that, that locates in the engine, in this mount, just on top of the alternator. Actually, if you take that off, it gives you that extra bit of wiggle room to pull that about, gives you some space to get the timing cover up through the engine this way. Word of warning, just be careful. Remember that pickup ring down there? It works like an ABS sensor. That's a magnetic strip on the edge of that, which the crank sensor picks up on. Try not to damage that, taking this cover off, because it sits perfectly inside there. So make sure you are nice and clear of that ring when you take it out. But there we are, the cover's now out. We have access to the whole belt and the water pump. So let's get everything locked off and get the belt off, the tensioner, the guides, and even the water pump out. Okay, so here we are back under the vehicle. So just to let you know, this is the pickup ring like we discussed earlier. Now actually at the top here there is a circular hole just in front of my finger there. You can that is actually in line with a hole in the engine block, which allows you to put a 5mm drill bit in there to lock it off, well, not to lock it off, because it's quite a small thin bit of metal, that, but it just confirms that the crank is in the correct position, which will be top dead center. So from here onwards we'll put a 5mm drill bit in there. More importantly though, to remove the timing belt you need to remove the crank sensor. So just with an 8mm, I think that is, take that out and then it just pops out. Okay, here we go. So everything is off. I've now got the drill bit locking off the cam. There is also another locking pin for the fuel pump at the back. It locates just between two wires there. But again, belts and braces. I've also marked one of the teeth against the back of the block, purely because Worst case scenario, if that should go out of time or anything, I know exactly where it goes. So from here onwards, you just want to loosen off the tensioner, which is a 13mm bolt, and then that will allow you enough slack to remove the belt completely. Okay, so these tensioners are actually under their own tension, so using a 6mm Allen key, you just locate that in there. And which way do we want to go? We want to go clockwise to loosen off, to be able to take the belt off. There we are, and that is now nice and loose. So we can now take the belt off. There we are, and that is one timing belt removed. So from here onwards, in the kit will come with a new idler, a new tensioner, and with this particular kit does come with a new water pump, which we will be changing out. Okay, there we are. So the tension is now removed, the guide pulley is now removed. We now need to remove the water pump, which is just down here, held in with various what looks to be 8mm bolts. So the good thing about being on a trolley jack is that you can just raise the engine, lower the engine as much or as little as you like to get you into tight spaces, or just to give you enough room. And the other really good thing is that this particular engine, where it is in top dead center at the moment, there doesn't actually appear to be a position where it's on a compression stroke. So actually, if I was to remove the timing bits, if you will, that hasn't actually sprung anywhere, it's still in place. So it's always good to keep them in there because you never know, but at the moment everything is holding itself in place, but that is not to say it wouldn't move when you're working around it. So that just makes life that little bit easier. Okay, here we are then, guys. So I've brought you back to the bench purely because now is the time to open up the box and just show you exactly what a typical Cambelt kit will come with. Now, by all means, don't get me wrong, if there is any opportunity at the earliest point to open up the new parts to compare with the old parts, just in case you get so far along, realise they're not the right parts, then you kind of avoid disabling the vehicle. But if you're taking your time, if it's on a driveway or something like that, private land, blah, 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 and you can just leave it there and come back to it another day, then fantastic. But when you're in the industry like I am, you've got to try and manage customers' expectations and try and just manage for any disasters like wrong parts and then have a vehicle stranded on a ramp. Anyway, ramble over. So this is what you get in a Cambelt kit. So in this specific kit, I requested a new water pump. So actually this particular kit comes with a water pump inside the Cambelt kit ready to go, because actually a lot of the times you just get the Cambelt kit without a water pump. So you obviously get a new Cambelt, you'll get new guide pulleys or pulley, and you will always get a new tensioner. You will get a lot of the times, not all the time, a lot of the time, new crank pulley bolts. And in this particular respect, we have a new water pump with a new metal gasket compared to the paper one that's just come off. So that is what you'll normally get. Sometimes you will actually get new bolts or nuts for the pulleys and the tensioner. In this particular instance, we have to reuse the old ones. So There is the old bolt for the tensioner, which goes in that way, and that is the nut for the guide pulley that goes on there. So the only thing I'm going to put into this point here, what you're probably asking yourself, why you're replacing the water pump, especially if it's not leaking. And to be fair, the old one was not leaking at all. Imagine, cam belt, very important. So this is the belt that stops moving components inside the engine colliding with each other, keeps everything in time. So it's incredibly important. And this belt does actually drive the water pump via that sprocket there. Now, although it's not leaking, when you do put on a new belt and a new tensioner, there is actually going to be probably a fair bit more tension in a new belt and a new tensioner, which, if you think about it, is going to put extra exerted pressure or tension on an older style water pump. Now, this is a 2013 plate, so it is 10 years old. Anything can happen to that water pump over 10 years. And you kind of want to weigh up the costs. If it was my car and I just put on a new belt around the old water pump and the old water pump started leaking, I will have to take this all off again, which is going to incur a lot more labour cost for the customer, as opposed to maybe an extra 50, 60 quid for a water pump and coolant. But the other thing you say to yourself as well is, well, what if the old water pump, which might be a little bit weaker than the new one, under a tension of a new belt, collapses? Well, then you are going to have an untimed belt, it's going to slip, it's going to come off, you are going to have catastrophic damage, and you are going to need a new engine. So, on that note, for the sake of what, maybe an extra 50, 60 quid to get in a kit or separately, I would always replace the water pump, because it alleviates any potential problems for the new belt or the engine to run into within the next 10 years, where this will have to be replaced again. Hope that will make sense. So in this case, new water pump, new tensioner, guide, crank pulley, more importantly belt. So let's get that water pump back in. Okay, so off camera I have just put the new water pump back in. If you've seen a couple of my other videos where we've removed water pumps before, just make sure that you clean up the mating surfaces where the gasket will lay, and then tighten everything up to the correct tightening torques. Now for this particular one, it's 2 steps. The first step is 7 Newton meters. The second step is followed by 10 Newton meters all round. So that is all nice and torqued. The next thing I'm going to do now is put the new guide pulley on here and tighten that up to spec as well. Now that that's on there and torqued up, the tightening torque for that nut there is 37 Newton meters, which I've just done. Now it's time to finger tight put on the new tensioner. Okay, so with the new tensioner and the original bolt, it's very important actually, let's get you focused on that. This hole serves a purpose. There is actually a dowel just down here, which I'll get you zoomed in if that hasn't already focused, that locates specifically in between that hole where my finger is there. So as long as that's located and the new screw, or the new bolt even, goes through there and screws into the block, you'll be absolutely fine. And remember, we just want this finger tight for now. So just to get you zoomed in on that, you can probably see now, there it is, just at the back here, that's the dowel, and that square open bit has gone over either side. And then that is just nice and loose to the point where it's just starting to snug, purely because we have a pin here, because the whole tensioner is under its own sprung loaded tension. So when we've got the belt back on, we're going to remove that, and then we're going to tension it. So now we're in a position where we can now put the new timing belt on. Now make sure that you can actually adjust the tensioner with the bit at the back. You want to make sure that's completely detensioned because that will make putting the belt on a lot easier. Make sure you don't knock that pin out. Best way to do this, start at the crank, work your way round in a anti-clockwise way, making sure that from the crank around the guide to the cam, the belt is in its most taut position, because it's going to be this side which will have the slack that the tensioner will take up. So just as I'm going to put this on, once you've checked the new belt, sometimes it has arrows in the direction of rotation. So if you have arrows pointing that way, that is the way it's going to want to go around the engine, because the engine will always rotate from this point of view in a clockwise motion. Okay, so the new belt is on. So like I said, make sure this side of the belt between the crank guide and the cam is taut. And then the other side, as you can see, this is quite slack on this side, quite rightly so, because now what we're going to do is we're going to remove this pin and put the belt under the tensioner's natural sprung-loaded tension. So, let me get you zoomed in. Okay, there we go. So you probably just saw that. It was only a little bit of movement, but it was enough to put this under a bit more tension. And then what's going to happen, we're now going to tension it up manually to really put the correct tension in this side, or the back side of the cam belt. Okay, so it's now time to manually adjust the tensioner. So using your 6mm Allen key, we want to turn this center part anti-clockwise, so backwards, until the pointer down at the back in that window where we located the square part on the dowel is perfectly in the middle. Now it's really difficult to see. I need to be able to see this to make sure that I've got it tensioned up correctly, but I'll try my best to show you the finished result. Okay, sorry if I got in the way there, but that is now tensioned up and tightened to 30 Newton meters. Now this might be really difficult to see. There we go, just poking out at the back there. You can see, there we go, that small little mark with the tiny hole in it came round and is now lined up with where that dowel is. So that is absolutely fine. Now we need to take all the locking pins out, turn it over and make sure everything settles in exactly the same place. Okay, so I've removed all the locking pins, so let's turn this engine over twice, or the crankshaft over twice, because there's 2 crankshaft revolutions to 1 revolution of the camshaft, and then we'll see if all the timing marks and the pins line up as they should do. Oh, with it, knocking the camera. Still in focus there. Okay, so it's just coming up to the mark right there. Just pull that round a bit more. There we go, that is in. We are also lined up on the fuel pump. And if I just go down here, I'm going to have to take my word for it, but we are also lined up on the bottom there. Our timing marks Timing marks at the top line up. So that's the cam. That is the fuel pump one. You can just see down there, the pin is locked off in the crank. So I'm more than happy with that. As you can see, I temporarily put the crank pulley back on and the crank shaft bolt, purely because I can turn it over. Now I'm going to quickly remove it again and start putting everything back together. And more importantly, now you're going to have to take my word for this, down there, I can just see it, you probably can't, but the tensioner mark is perfectly in the middle of where it should be, so that is definitely the correct tension. I am more than happy with that, and if you're doing it as well, you should be more than happy with that too. So, on that note, I'm a little bit against the clock. Basically, I'm now going to put everything back in reverse order of as we took it off, put it back together, fill it up with coolant, bleed it out, and we're all done for the day. Okay everyone, so everything is going back together really well. Just a quick point to make. When you're tightening up the crank, the new crank pulley bolt, the specific tightening torques are 35 Newton meters to start, followed by 190 degrees rotation. So you do need something that's going to hold the crank pulley, because even 35 Newton meters is more than enough to turn the actual pulley and the cam belt itself. So what I have is this crank holding tool. It's got basically, it's like a Y fork style with a couple of pins on the end, and they locate just in a couple of spaces in the crank, and then I let it come round and effectively lock against the lower arm as you tighten it up to the specifications. Sorry I couldn't show you that as I was doing it. I'm only one person here on my own. I need both my hands and I need to be in the way, so apologies, but again, that is a specific tool that will help you tighten up the crank pulley bolt to the specific tightening torques, which is incredibly important. If it's not tight enough, you're going to have a bad day. Okay guys, and there we have it. We are all done for the day. Now, obviously, I put everything together behind the scenes. You're just putting everything back in reverse order. The only thing you need to concentrate on is just that crank shaft pulley, the new bolt. Just make sure you get that tightened correctly. So, on that note, I'm going to run it up to temperature now and then take it back to the customer. But we are all done for the day. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you've enjoyed what you've liked, that's not right. If you've enjoyed what you've watched, or perhaps learned a little something, please don't hesitate to drop the like button. More importantly, hit that subscribe button, hit the little bell button, and you will be notified every time I upload a video. There are plenty more coming down the pipeline as always. Guys, thank you so much indeed. Have a great rest of the day, whatever you're up to, and we'll see you guys in the next video.